Welcome to our third session on this passage. There are lots of ways Jesus could say his very simple phrase. And it's always good when you have the time to play with different emphasis, different placements of pauses, different tone as, uh, as you rehearse a line. And so the line I want to focus is on, do you want to be made well? And I read it there, told it to you there kind of flat. But you could emphasize any one of those words. Do you want to be well? Or do you want to be made well? 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 And each of those options would shape the way the person whom Jesus engaging responds. And so if Jesus says, do you want to be made well? Right? The person might be like, how dare you? Sir, I have no one. Right? So it might be an accusation by Jesus met with a defense. Do you want to be healed? Sir, I have no one. Right? So if Jesus is emphasizing him, he might emphasize himself back to Jesus. One of the things that happens as it's translated from oral to English is you need visual cues for a reader at the front end of a sentence so that they know what's coming. And so we have this translation, do you want to be made well? But in performance, you can, by tone, make it clear that it's a question. So it could be, and this is the way I think I kind of want to go with it. It's like Jesus leaning in, like me saying to my wife, you want to have ice cream? It's not really a question. It's an invitation. And so if Jesus does that, you want to be made well? Then there's some options there in terms of the man's response. So let's just listen to the exchange. In these lay many who were sick, blind, lame, paralyzed. One man was there who had been sick for 38 years. When Jesus saw him lying there and knew that he'd been there a long time, he said to him, you want to be healed? And the man who was sick said to him, Sir, I have no one. Thank you so much for spending time with me again. Almost there. I think it's fair that we could also say about this man that he lives on the edge of hope, just that far from hope that he never seems able to get to. I will confess to you today that things didn't go as I had planned in the week. I had told you last week, write it on a note card, carry it around with you, look at it every day, and those little bite-sized pieces will do wonders for your learning. Well, I woke up this morning realizing I had a deadline approaching and hadn't touched it for an entire week, and so I spent more than a half an hour looking at it, writing it out on the note card, going for a walk with my dog, reciting it over and over. This week I noticed, though, by having this larger block of time, struggling to internalize the passage, that there were lots of details about the main character besides Jesus that I might not notice if I don't slow down and think about it. So we learn that he has been suffering from this illness for 38 years. There are clues in the text that he has mobility issues. Maybe the first one is that the people described in the area are blind and lame and paralyzed. And his issue is not that he can't see when the water is stirred, but that he just can't get to it in time. So there's some kind of mobility issues. We learned that he is alone. I have no one to help me get into the water. I tried to blend my growing understanding of the person with people I've seen in situations on the streets or in public as Jesus encounters this man who has clearly suffered for a long time. I think of the streets of Latin America and the cities where people are looking up, asking for help. There are lots of ways we could play this man. Just as there are lots of ways that the people that I saw in Latin America are caught in their suffering. One is to let the illness totally define them. And sometimes you see people and you're feeling, at least, whether it's accurate or not, is they're just in a situation that's pathetic. And I think that's our default when we come to people who are ill, as though their whole life is defined by their illness, so that Jesus' transformation can seem even that much more grand. But that's not the only way that we encounter people in these situations. Sometimes there are people who know how to play to an audience and play themselves pathetic because they know that'll win sympathy. And then there are people who are like, don't treat me as though I'm pathetic. I'm still a human being, I have dignity, and how dare you think you know about my situation more than I do, and are willing to confront those who treat them paternalistically. So all of these are a possible way of playing this character, and I think that you need to decide one of those. I think it's also helpful to imagine the scene in all its detail. So I'm going back to the streets of Latin America, and there are certain things I see, and my body responds to what I see, sometimes looking away, sometimes looking closer, sometimes trying to look at the face instead of the festering wounds. Right? So I bring that memory in. There are scents. This man has nobody to move him around. And he's been there for 38 years. It's not some miraculous divinity that allows Jesus. I like to play the narrator as though I'm describing it as I see it. So, for example, in these lay many who were sick, blind, lame, paralyzed. Right? As though I'm describing things as they're unfolding before me, instead of like I've rehearsed this list, although I have, and can just rattle it off. I noticed when I was looking at the list that the Greek doesn't include the word and, so the NRSV has blind, lame, and paralyzed. But it's got more of a punch to it in the Greek. There, in these lay many who were sick, blind, lame, paralyzed. It's not just a list, it's these things that are being seen. The English translations are translated to be read, and so they're thinking of what the translator imagined your composition teacher would want good English to sound like. And so they add ands when there aren't any. They take them away when they're there if they don't think that meets the imagined aesthetic. Right? Oh, there was a challenge I had I couldn't get the first clause of this whole thing right. In these lay. And I want to say among them were the porticles it's describing, which we'll learn about next week. There were in them lay, and so finally I made it into one word in my mind. in these lay, in these lay, in these lay. And then it kind of has that inlay in it that helps me remember. So in these lay many who are sick. You don't have to, at this moment, worry about getting it precise. But I'm moving towards a time where I want it printed in the bulletin and want to be as close to it as possible. For now, I just ask them not to print it in the bulletin when I'm telling it, so people aren't following along but are listening. I like to bring the senses in when Jesus is doing that. So, and when Jesus saw him lying there and knew that he'd been there a long time, so there are good reasons that anyone, including Jesus, would know that this man had been lying there for a long time. One of the challenges is when there's a list. This is a short list, so maybe you can just figure it out by the rhythm of it or repetition. But how do you remember it in order if that's important for you? And so in this one, I imagined, and it's not so important that it's true, it's important that I imagine it this way, that there's kind of like an escalation of challenges in terms of getting to the water, if mobility is the issue. It would be difficult to get there if you were blind. But if you were lame, the moving would be even more difficult, and then even more so if you were paralyzed. And so I could remember it by that escalating levels of challenge. Or you could just say alphabetically, okay, I know the three things. Which order do they come in? B, blind, L, lame, P, paralyzed.